talking this evening about developments in the late 15th and early 16th century. And I'm going to be talking about the period that historians would call the gathering together of the Russian land. It emerges as a state. But I'm less interested in culture than I am in cultural history. I'm sorry, in history than I am in cultural history. So what I'm going to be talking about are the visible manifestations of that development. And having promised that I would keep my eye on the Scandinavian influence, what I'm going to be talking about is the Greco-Scandinavian Slavic influenced by Mongol domination, and now this evening we're going to talk about the influence of the Italian Renaissance. So all of these things come together in the what I'm calling the rise of Moscow. And the most visible physical manifestation of the rise of Moscow is, of course, the Moscow Kremlin. I'm going to try and get out of the way of your picture.
You're standing on the because you want your whole picture.
Okay. And I'm just curious, in this audience, does the word Kremlin have any particular connotations for you? Apparently it does. It's very interesting when I give this lecture to students, to undergraduates, it no longer does have connotations. But in the context of this lecture, what I'm talking about is the medieval fortification that would have been characteristic of any medieval city. And that was the Kremlin, the citadel. Often in English travel literature, it's called the castle. So what I'm talking about is the walled center of any medieval city. Every medieval city has a Kremlin, not just Moscow. This, for example, is the Kremlin wall in the city of Pskov. And I want to give you some sense of where these things are located, and then I'll come back and take a closer look at them. Most of this period that I'm going to be talking about, the visible manifestations are going to be architecture, which of course is not my specialty. So I'm relying very heavily on William Brumfeld, who is probably the best known scholar of Russian architecture. Where the city of Moscow now stands, there was Slavic settlement. Archaeological excavations have shown that there was a Slavic settlement there for centuries and centuries and centuries. But during the early part of Russian history, it was a very, very insignificant site. Moscow, where it presently stands, is where the river Nevinaya and the river Moskva, Moscow, come together. And the city itself started in that little triangle in the middle. And it was very insignificant until the Mongols, the invasions of Genghis Khan, overrode some of the older cities, and refugees from those cities that were conquered by the Mongols started congregating in this little place, little provincial town known as Moscow, and that was really when it started to grow. Initially this would have been the walled, fortified city center, and that's what we now know as the Kremlin, the castle. And it grew in concentric circles, as did many, practically all medieval cities. And the concentric circles were really layers of fortification. So the first layer of fortification was the Kitai Gorod. And Kitai means China, and Gorod means city. And so people who know a little bit of Russian think, oh, cool, they had a Chinatown. But they didn't. Kitai here is referring to wicker baskets filled with earth, and that's what the fortification was built out of. And Gurit, which has come to mean city, meant defended place. So this was the first line of defense. Eventually that was replaced with masonry, and if you visit Moscow today, you can still see some of that old wall. Some of it is still standing. The second circle of Robe was the Bielý Goret, which really does mean white fortification because it was whitewashed. Today that corresponds with what in modern Moscow is the ring road. So these old layers of fortification are still very present in the way the town is laid out. And then there was a further layer of fortification that was the earthen fortification. And in the 19th century, after the need for that kind of fortification had passed, many of the gentry built their country estates there. That later became one of the boulevards. The word boulevard is related to bulwark. And today that is another one of the ring roads, the so-called Garden Ring Road in contemporary Moscow. And then aside from those layers of fortification, there was another line of defense in the various convents and monasteries that surrounded the city itself. And of course, they were all fortified as well. So these were all layers of defense. Now, to give you a little bit of background of the growth of this place, it was first fortified about the 13th century, and there was an oaken fort built there. What I'm going to be talking about today, though, are primarily the developments that occurred during the reign of two particular princes. One of them is Ivan III. He reigned at the end of the 15th century, and his son Vasily, also the third, who reigned at the beginning of the 16th century. And the history of the cultural development of Russia is very much tied to its relationship to the church. And the Orthodox Church in the 15th century separated from the Greek Orthodox Church and became a separate entity. That was one thing that happened that was very important. And the second thing that happened was in 1453, the Ottoman Empire conquered Constantinople, the seat of the Greek Church. And this caused a number of things to happen. One of them was a perception that Russia was now the only free Orthodox country in the world, and that Russia was therefore the defender of the faith, that Russia had a special role to play. And the other was that Ivan III married Sophia Paleologa, who was the niece of the last emperor of Byzantium, who had died defending Constantinople. And she was the ward of the Pope in Rome. So this marriage brought in a massive influx of Byzantine influence, but it also created this connection with Italy, and that's where the influence of the Italian Renaissance that I was talking about is going to come from. Now, as soon as Sophia arrived, within 2 years of her arriving, a delegation was sent to Italy to bring back architects. And you can kind of imagine her saying, "Oh dear, don't you think we should replace that old church with something more modern?" At any rate, there was a delegation to Italy, and it was followed by numerous other delegations. And I'm always looking for the technological innovation that makes things happen. They brought with them that grand innovation that made so many changes possible. They brought with them brick making. And I want to show you very quickly where they built things, and then we'll go back and take a closer look at what they built. And this was all under Ivan III. The first thing they did was build the fortification. Defense was still very important. And then within that fortification, they cleared away some of the existing older churches, which was very controversial, and started building new churches. The first one is the so-called Cathedral of the Dormitior. And as I said, we'll come back and take closer looks at all of these things. That was followed by the Cathedral of the Annunciation. Another smaller church called the Church of the Deposition of the Robe. A secular building at long last, the so-called faceted chamber. And living quarters, the so-called Terem Palace. And then later, under Vasily III, during the reign of the son, the bell tower that is called Ivan the Great was added. And also during his reign, the last of the cathedrals was added to Cathedral Square, and that is the so-called Archangel Cathedral. And then, just very quickly, I want to show you some of the things that were added later, because if you visit the Kremlin, or if you have visited the Kremlin, you'll see all of these things in one place at one time. Some of the later additions to the Kremlin that are very noticeable are the Tsar Cannon and the Tsar Bell and another cathedral, and another church that I'll show you later on. Now, at this point, people will ask, my goodness gracious, why were these princes building all of these cathedrals? Why did they need so many different churches? And of course, the churches were all used for different purposes. They were all used. But one of the main reasons for building all of these churches inside the Kremlin was to have this visible sense of the might and the power and the glory of the princes of Moscow. And you can imagine, if you're coming out of that flat Russian plain, all of a sudden arising in front of you is this whitewashed, white and glittering and gold spectacle of cupola and bell towers rising into the heavens. And it made quite an impression, I can imagine, and it still does, even in contemporary Moscow. This is a 19th century watercolor. The walls here are whitewashed, and it was known forever and ever and ever as the white-walled Kremlin. Now, I want to go back inside the Kremlin and look at some of those buildings that I was showing you. And I'm going to go a little bit out of order, because one of the buildings, which is a little bit smaller and a little more modest, is the Deposition of the Robe. And I'm sorry I got ahead of myself. I wanted to tell you one thing about the walls of the Kremlin, because the walls were the most important thing that came first. The walls were intended for defense. They were not intended for decoration. And at the time, and so they were the first things built. And at the time they were built, each one of them had 3 separate firing stations. They were cut off from each other. Each one was supposed to be impregnable. And in the 15th and 16th centuries, they would have stopped here. All of these spires were added later. But the medieval fortress were these shorter towers that were intended really for purposes of defense. There are 20 towers in all, each one of them different. And not to worry, I'm not going to show all of them to you, but I would like to show you 1 or 2 of them. The most important ones, of course, are the ones on the corners, the corner towers, and the entrance towers. This is one of the earliest 15th century towers. Again, in the 15th century, it would have ended right there. The spire was added on later. And one of the things that's very noticeable in this slide is this kind of crenellated effect in the wall. That was, of course, already very old-fashioned in Italy by the time it was brought into Russia. But for the purposes of the Russians, who were dealing with adversaries on horseback, it was just fine. It was a perfect way to build a fortress. So that Italian crenellation came in. Here is another one of the corner towers, also from approximately the same period. Again, remember that it would have ended right there at that time, and then here's the crenellated wall. Some of the most impressive ones were done by the brothers Solari. They built this gate tower. This is one of the entrance towers. Here's another one of the entrance towers. This one faces the red square. And then the most famous of them, the one that is most symbolic, is the so-called Savior Tower, which is the main entrance. And this one was the largest and tallest and most massive of them all, because there's no natural barrier by this one. The others were all on the riversides, but this one has no barrier. It's called the Savior Tower because there was a chapel in the bottom of it, as there were in most of the gate towers. And then the clock, which is what Russians listen to on New Year's Eve, and the spire were added later. Going back inside the Kremlin now, this is the church I wanted to show you. This is the Deposition of the Robe. And I wanted to start with this one because it's smaller, it's more modest, and it also is more traditionally Russian. This one was probably built by Russian builders, and it's more typical of the northern Russian architecture that would have been common at the time. Now, of course, Ivan III was bringing in Italian architects, and he was asking them to do something new and very different. But he did a very interesting thing with his Italian architects. He asked them, before they built anything, to go and study some of the famous churches of the 12th century. And in particular, he asked them to look at the Cathedral of the Dormitior, a 12th century church in the ancient city of Vladimir. And so the Italian architects came back and they studied this church, and then they came back to Moscow, and within the Moscow Kremlin they built another church of the Dormitior that keeps the five-dome structure that clearly refers to the older church, but that includes a lot of technical innovations, including the fact that it's made out of brick rather than stone, and including the fact that it has some internal modification that permits a lot more natural light to come into it. Now, I want to say a word about the name of this church. This is the feast when the soul of Mary ascends to heaven, and it is variously translated as the Church of the Dormition, the Church of the Ascension. I think there's another one in there. It's also called in English Uspensky Cathedral. And since it's easier for me to remember that word than any of the changing translations, that's what I'm going to be calling it, the Uspensky Cathedral. And this Uspensky Cathedral was and is the most significant church in Russia. This was the church that was used for the crowning of the princes up until the Revolution. And in recent times, it has been again used for ceremonial purposes. So since the fall of the Soviet Union, this church is not in constant use, but it has been reopened and used. As I said, the interior of it permits quite a bit of natural light. This is what it looked like in a 19th century depiction during a service. You can see it's covered with frescoes, as were all of the churches. And this is what it looks like today. All of the churches that I'm showing you inside the Kremlin are open to the public. So if you happen to visit Moscow, you should certainly take a tour of the Kremlin. You should certainly visit these churches and see what they look like in the interior. As I said, this church was used for crowning. And that would be the other reason for building so many churches at this time. Again, these churches are the outward manifestation of the increasing power of the princes of Muscovy. And one of the ways they're showing that power is by stressing their connection. I'm sorry, not with the Scandinavians, but with the Byzantine Greeks. And so at this point in history, the princes of Moscow are going to be taking more and more and more of the physical things that they associate with the power that they see passing to them from the defeated Byzantine Empire. One of those artifacts is the so-called crown of Monomach. Monomach is referring to Constantine Monomach of Byzantium. But at this point in history, the Russians are simply using it to mean autocrat, and they're using the term to show that with this hat or crown, the right and authority of Byzantium has passed to them. The artifact is itself not Byzantine. This is probably, the gold part is probably fairly old, but the jewels and the fur were probably added about 15th century, about the time that we're talking about. This is also the time when Ivan III, by virtue of his marriage to the niece of the last Byzantine emperor, begins to use the double-headed eagle as the sign of Moscow, the symbol that is still associated with the Russian state today. So that was the first and the most important of the churches that they built. The second one is the so-called Cathedral of the Annunciation. If the Uspensky Cathedral was used for ceremonial crowning, the Cathedral of the Annunciation, which is called the Blagoveshchenski Cathedral, was the private chapel of the royal family. And the interior of it is, it's covered with frescoes, it's quite imposing, it's quite beautiful, but the things that are depicted are a little more domestic, a little more intimate. This church was greatly remodeled in the 16th century, and one of the things that was added is this architectural detail that's so noticeable to us today. These are called kapushniki because they look like the woman's hat. And every time I say that, I can see people trying to get their mind around the Easter bonnet and the architectural detail, and it just doesn't work. So I thought I would show you what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the woman's hat that kind of has that pointed shape that is part of the traditional costume, the kapushnik, and that's where that architectural detail takes its name. The third of the cathedrals that completes the so-called cathedral square is the Cathedral of the Archangel Michael, called the Archangel Cathedral, Archangelski. And again, you can see that it keeps the five-domed medieval pattern, but the Italian architect has added the scallops of Italian palace architecture. And this is an innovation in Russia, but from now on we're going to see those scallops all over the place. They're going to become very popular. This is named for the Archangel Michael, who is the warrior saint. This is the cathedral where the princes would have gone to pray before going into battle, which was a constant feature of their lives. It is also the cathedral where the princes were buried. In medieval times, the burials would have been in the floor. These caskets have been added more recently, but this was the place of burial for the royal family. And the frescoes here depict various heroes from the military, and not only military, but from the past. And heroes of the past normally are associated with military feats. This, for example, is Alexander Nevsky, the great hero of Novgorod of the 12th century. Now, those three cathedrals together make what is known as Cathedral Square. There is another square that is made of the bell tower. And this is the bell tower. This is the bell tower that is called Ivan the Great. And sometimes it's confused with Ivan the Third. You know, is this named for him? It's actually not named for him. It's named for the chapel of St. John that's in the base of it, and it's called the Great because it's so tall. Like any other building, this would have had a dual purpose. It was the tallest building in Moscow, and of course it would have been used as a watchtower. It was very important to have that tall place from which you could look out across the plains and see the enemy approaching. A little bit later, the belfry was added. The belfry had 21 bells in it. The largest one of them was 64 tons. And to ring them, people stood on the ground. And I have a depiction or a description of that. To cause the bells to peal, needed were 24 ringers, if not more. They stood on the square below and holding cords attached to 2 long ropes, suspended from either side of the bell tower, pulled in this manner all together, now from one side, now from another. Later on, this superstructure was added. It was actually added by Boris Godunov. If you get up close to it, as we are here, you can actually see the inscription saying it was dedicated by Tsar Boris. And then later on, the matching helmet structure was added to the belfry. And all together, with all of these changes, the two of them together produce really what is one of the most pleasing and impressive, to my eye, architectural ensembles in the world. In the 19th century, when Napoleon occupied the Kremlin, when he retreated, he destroyed many of the buildings inside the Kremlin, and he set this bell tower to be destroyed. He set explosives in it. But the foundation of this medieval building was so firm, or so over-engineered, as one of my students pointed out, that he cracked it, but he was not able to destroy the bell tower. Now, just very quickly, I want to show you some of the later things that you will see if you visit the Kremlin, some of the things that are on the square of this bell tower, because I know if if you visit, you'll see them, and I'll always feel bad if I don't mention them. One of them is the so-called Tsar cannon, called that because of its size. It weighs about 40 tons. Each one of the bells weighs about a ton. It was never intended to be fired. It's simply an example of the art of casting. The same thing is the so-called Tsar bell, again called that because of its size. It's never been used. As you can see, it's broken. During the casting of it, there was one of those fires that destroys wooden cities periodically throughout history, and water was thrown on the bell to save it from the fire, and the water caused it to crack. So it's never been rung, but it is an impressive example of this kind of art. Now I want to step back from the cathedrals and look at some of the palaces that were built. It's very interesting that the princes, in having this visual manifestation of their power, first built the fortification and then the cathedrals, and then they finally got around to some palaces. The first of these it's a rather small building, is the so-called faceted chamber. Again, this was built by the same architects, the Solari brothers, who built so much of the Kremlin walls. And it's called faceted because of this architectural detail, because of that texturing of the external wall. This was, well, let me show you where it stands. It's built facing the cathedral square. So all of the cathedrals I showed you will be here, there, and in front of you. This is where it's located on the cathedral square. This is a 19th century painting. And here's the faceted chamber, and here's the Blagoveshchenski church that we were just looking at. The bottom layer of the faceted chamber is a ceremonial hall, and that was the formal location of the throne. This is what it looked like in the 17th century. Again, you can see its location relative to the churches. This is the Uspensky Cathedral. You can see the people going into the Uspensky Cathedral. This is for the crowning of Michael Romanov. But you can also see that there was a very different roof on this at that point in time. This is the interior of it at that same time. This is from the same series, and you can see from this interior depiction that there's a massive pillar in the middle of the room that supports it. And a feature from medieval times forward was to arrange all of the silver and gold plate around that pillar, again, kind of as a visible manifestation of the worth of the prince. This is what it looked like in the 19th century. And again, you can see in the 19th century, you still have that display of gold plate around that pillar. And this is what it looks like today. The frescoes have been added, I believe they were added in the 19th century, and they're intended to look like the medieval frescoes. But of course, they're not quite. They're kind of a 19th century interpretation of what the medieval frescoes would have looked like. The other important building was the so-called Terem Palace. And as I said, this is a very ancient site. And the ruling family, the princes, have been living there with their families for ages and ages and ages. But what they do is take the existing palace and kind of make another addition to it for each new family. And what you get is this kind of fairy tale rabbit warren of different living quarters. And so during this period of tremendous growth that we're talking about, All of this was consolidated into the so-called Terem Palace, and it no longer exists, so I can't show you what it looks like today. Parts of it have been incorporated into other buildings. But this is what it looked like in the 19th century. This is kind of an exaggerated perspective. But you can tell, even from this one painting, that there always was a kind of a fairy tale aspect to it. I'll show you a little bit of the interior. The exterior no longer exists, but parts of the interior have been incorporated into other buildings. This would be the so-called throne room. This would have been the main chamber of the structure. This is the heating apparatus. This is the Russian stove that heats it. I'll show you just a couple of more shots from the interior. Again, the frescoes are intended to look like the medieval frescoes, but they're kind of a 19th century interpretation. This is the so-called cross room, where the prince would have received ambassadors. And then this, I always like to show people's bedrooms. This would have been the bedroom of the prince. So that's where the ruler of Muscovy slept. There was a similar living quarter for the Tsarina, or the princess. And again, most of that has been remodeled beyond recognition, so I won't try to show you that. One of the chapels attached to the princess's living quarters is the so-called Chapel of the Savior behind the Golden Grill. And again, the interior has been remodeled beyond recognition, but the exterior is still one of the most pleasing sights, one of the most striking things that you see as you walk through the Kremlin. So I thought I would close perhaps by showing you that. It's a little bit later than the time we're talking about. It's particularly the exuberant blue ceramic work is more characteristic of the 17th century than of the 15th and 16th centuries. But it is one of the most striking of the little details that you notice as you walk through. And since we were talking this evening about the visible attributes of the power and might of the Russian princes, I thought I would show you that as well. Now, I forgot to ask about time. Would this be a good time to stop and entertain questions, or do you want me to talk about it? Was that a little longer?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. The period that I'm talking about is also the golden age of the icon. And when in the 10th century Russian adopted Greek Orthodoxy, one of the consequences of that was that all of the forms associated with the Greek Orthodox Church come into Russia, and they're very quickly assimilated. And they very quickly become forms of expression that are characteristic of Russian culture. In the early period, the icons would have been fairly dark, fairly small, not too numerous. They are aids to worship. They would have been, one or two of them would have been placed on an altar. But we're entering a period where everything gets more elaborate and more complex. And that includes the icons themselves and also the way they are displayed. Perhaps the unique Russian contribution to the world of icons, if you will, is the iconostasis, which is to say this wall of icons that can appear at the front of the Russian church. Again, remember, in earlier times there would have been just one or two of them set out on the altar. And now this has evolved in this tremendously complex arrangement. And I'll tell you a little bit about it. This is a depiction of the iconostasis in the Blagoveshchensk Cathedral, the cathedral that we were looking at earlier with the Kakoshniki. And it's a beautiful thing in its own right, but it also shows you the various things that would be included in an iconostasis. You would always have the holy door. That would include a depiction of the Last Supper above the holy door. And then to the right of it, you can't see it here, but to the right of it you would have an icon either of Christ or else of the person to whom the church is dedicated. To the left of it you would have an icon of the Mother of God. I believe in this particular cathedral it would have been the so-called Virgin of Vladimir. And then in the next row, and this is an innovation, you have the so-called Chin, where you have Christ in glory in the center, and then in descending order of importance, you have the Mother of God and John the Baptist, and then other figures of importance, all bowing toward the central figure. The third row is the row of liturgical feasts, all of them in very stylized depictions. The icon, if you recall, is anonymous, so that it's not intended to be realistic. So this is all very stylized. The next row is the row of the prophets. These are Old Testament prophets. And then in this particular church, which is very grand indeed, you have a final row, which is the row of the patriarchs, which has figures from the Old Testament. Now, in a smaller church, this last row might be omitted. The icons were introduced certainly in the 10th century, and then as Russia became more and more isolated from Byzantium, they developed so that they now look more Russian than they do Byzantine. They have continued to be, though, very abstract. They are aids to worship, as I said. They're not intended to be representational. And for the most part, they are anonymous. But at this period, we start to learn a few names of a few of the great icon masters. And the greatest of these certainly is Andrei Rublev. This is his depiction of Christ in glory. This is one of the common themes for icons, or common patterns for icons. I'll show you a few of his icons. We looked earlier at a very traditional depiction of the Archangel Michael, the warrior saint. This is Rublev's depiction of the Archangel Michael. Certainly a much softer depiction. This is clearly from that the row that I call the Chin row, where the figure is bending over toward the Christ figure. No one is quite sure, but it's possible that this icon is from that church in Vladimir that I showed you earlier. This is Rublyov's depiction of the Apostle Paul, also from that same row where they're all bending toward the central figure. And this is certainly one of Rublyov's best-known images. This is his depiction of the Savior. Does this look familiar to any of you? This is the image that Trinity Episcopal now uses in their advertisements in the Oregonian. I'm kind of startled every time I see it, but this is in fact an icon by Andrei Rublev, the greatest of the Russian icon painters. And you can see all of these icons that I have shown you have been damaged. This one in particular, you can see fire damage on it. And the story, and I don't know if it's true or not, the great thing about cultural history is I don't have to care if it's true as long as it's a story people tell. The story is that during the period immediately following the revolution when the icons were being destroyed, this one was one of many thrown into the bonfire, and that a priest could not stand to see it burn, and reached in and pulled it out. And that's why we still have this image. As I said, I don't know if that's a true story or not, but it's a good story. So these are all examples of the work of Rublev, and the last one I want to show you is certainly his greatest and best known icon, the so-called Old Testament Trinity. And I would say that this is one of the two of the best known and best loved icons in the entire Russian tradition. As you can imagine, in a very abstract art, there is no way to depict the Holy Trinity. There are only one or three actually, approved patterns that can evoke it. And one of these is this Old Testament Trinity, which is the story of the three heavenly messengers who visit Abraham and Sarah and tell them of the forthcoming birth of Isaac. And this Old Testament story is taken to anticipate the Trinity of the New Testament. So icon painters could depict this story referencing the Trinity without actually depicting the Trinity. So here we have the depiction of the three messengers all united in this wonderful circular shape. All of them wearing different colors, but united by this radiant shade of Rublev blue, which really ties it all together. And you can see how abstract it is. They have been received and they're being hosted, but the only thing we see on the table is this kind of symbolic cup that symbolizes a meal. In later depictions, you'll have the tablecloth and all the dishes and the silverware, but here we just have that one detail that shows that a meal's being served. We have the one schematic tree and the one schematic mountain showing that it's exterior. We have the one schematic building showing where it is. So this is certainly the greatest work by the greatest of the Russian icon painters, one of the most easily recognized, best loved images. You can see this if you visit Moscow, I believe, at the Tretyakov Art Gallery, and it is well worth the visit. It is a very impressive thing to see. Now the other thing we see happening during this time, as I said, it's unusual to even know the name of an icon painter. So the fact that we know Rublev's name shows a kind of development in art. The fact that an individual's name is associated with these images, because these are acts of worship, they're anonymous. But we know Rublev's name, and we also at this time see the beginnings of what I'm going to call secularization of the icon. The icon has really been the only form of visual representation. And so if you want to depict things that are current or that are real, the only language that you have available to you is the language of the icon. And this is an example of what I'm talking about. This is an icon showing the life of the Metropolitan Peter. The Metropolitan Peter is a real person. He is really associated with the real construction of the Moscow Kremlin of the time that I've been talking about. And here you see a fairly typical arrangement of an icon. An icon is painted on wood, and the center part of it is planed down to make a smooth surface, and that kind of creates a natural frame around it. And very typically in this kind of icon, the central event, the central figure is painted on the center panel, and then the narrative is painted around the edges. So what you have here is the depiction of a real person, a metropolitan, mind you, but nonetheless a historical person, and you have his biography around the edges of the icon. And some of these panels, like this one, show you real events. This, for example, shows him becoming metropolitan. That's a real historical event. And this shows him laying the cornerstone for the Uspensky Cathedral, the first of the great cathedrals that we looked at earlier this evening. So when I'm talking about secularization, I'm talking about depicting real people and real contemporary events. But at the same time, we have here things that I would also describe as mythical events. And I want to close by showing you one of them. This is also from that biography around the border. This is the dream of Ivan. This is Ivan III, the first of the great builders, who's responsible for building most of what we've looked at this evening. And in his dream, he dreamt that he was riding with the Metropolitan Peter, and they were riding in front of a great mountain with melting snow. And the Metropolitan Peter then interpreted this dream to Ivan III, and he interpreted to predict the increasing might of the prince himself. Always a good interpretation. And the rise of the princedom of Moscow, which is what we've been talking about this evening. With that, I'd like to close, and that's okay, I was through quick. And I'll be happy to entertain questions. Thank you. Yes, sir.
Last picture you had of the cathedral with the towers, we had crosses on them.
Yes.
Where we down the cross, there appeared to be a crescent, insignificant crescent.
I am speculating. I don't know. And I can back up if you want to take a closer look at that. It is conceivable that that is referring to the struggle with the Ottoman Empire, but I cannot know. And I'll be happy to back up if you need to. Anything else?
I don't know, there's all those round things, were they real gold?
Are they real gold? They're different things. Some of them are in fact covered with real gold plate. Or, very thin gilded, yeah, that's what I'm trying to say. Some of them are a mixture of copper, that's where you get that reddish sheen. So they're made out of different things and they're covered with different things, but they sure are thin. Yes, sir.
I have a question that's from here, maybe way out of your area here. The name Roos,
Yes.
is that a name of a tribe or something that came over to Russia hundreds and hundreds of years before all this? Who are the Roos? Where did they come from?
That's an excellent question. That's an excellent question, and I don't know if you were able to hear. The question is, where does the word Rus come from? And when talking about, prior to this period, when talking about the Kievan period, the 10th century period, that is known as Rus. The question is, where does the word come
What is
from?
that period in relation to Christ? Before Christ or after Christ?
After. The question is, where does that word come from? And the honest answer is no one knows for sure. One of the speculations is that Rus is indeed a tribe, and that it indeed may be a Scandinavian tribe. Because there is a reference in the medieval chronicle to inviting the Vikings to come rule over the Rus. But no one really knows the etymology of that word. So that's a great question that no one has ever been able to answer. But that certainly is the most likely theory, I think. Yes, ma'am.
Have you visited over in Moscow recently?
About 4 years ago. Was the
Wonderful. My question is, I'm Finnish, from Finnish descent, and the Finns are not real crazy about the Russians.
I've noticed that.
And since two chunks of their country, the Finns, northern and southern area chunks, were taken in the 40s, I believe, back from, they were a Grand Duchy, I believe,
Right.
Russia. And so, have you seen any kind of information or found out any information about why in the world they figured they needed to grab back a couple of chunks of Finland? Why they felt, why the Russian group thought they should be holding and to get it back?
I have seen no reason to know why that would happen, except they could, and they got away with it.
And they did,
and
didn't
I have
they?
seen no indication that they intend to give it back.
Oh, darn it, yes. The Finns are, I was in Finland visiting with my mother and looking for our heritage, and I had a red jacket on, and an older Finlander thought I might have been a Ruski, and he was not, and he accosted me,
I bet.
whacked me on the arm, and they said they don't like anyone that wears any red.
Okay.
They associate it with the Russians, but I'm sure they live in peace now.
Squabbles, yes.
Squabbles, little here and there. Okay, thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
The question here, why did Russia take us to part? But the Petsamo Peninsula up in the north was full of nickel. So Russians wanted the nickel for the war purposes. And another reason was that they could easier get to the sea.
Sure. Thank you.
I was in the Kremlin and I went into one of these, it was 86, I went to one of these, and there were no seats. And the guide said people stood up during the service that they lasted 1.5 hours. They fainted one by one, especially the women. Have they seats? Do they have seats now? No. No, they just always
No,
stand
there
up.
are no seats now.
I see, okay.
It's all standing, and people do move around, so it's not quite as arduous as you're thinking.
That's true of any
But
Russian
outstanding.
cathedral or church,
Yes, ma'am.
even in this
Thank
country.
you. In the beginning, you said that this Sophia that was Ivan married was a ward of the Pope.
Correct.
I feel weird, but what the heck, what's the with the Pope
What's with the
having
Pope?
a ward of children?
Okay,
No, I mean wards of,
yeah.
what's that about?
Okay, the question is, I said that Sophia Paleologa was a ward of the Pope, and the question is, what's up with the Pope having wards? She was the niece of the last emperor of Byzantium, who was killed defending Constantinople, defending the church when it was defeated by the Ottoman Empire. And the Pope, as head of the Western Church, would have felt an obligation to be responsible for her, to protect her and take care of her. So it was his position of head of church, being responsible for her as the last representative of the Eastern group. Yes, ma'am.
The icons were so beautifully, the colors were still so beautifully preserved, or have they been retouched, because they were, some of them were 1400?
The colors are incredibly vibrant. They have been restored, but they have not been repainted. They have not been replaced with modern colors. Cleaned, but not replaced. Yes, ma'am.
How large are those works look like?
Some of them are very large indeed.
Like Peter's. Metropolitan Peter.
Metropolitan Peter. No, that is a good size piece of wood. The little liturgical ones are about yay big. But the bigger ones from the bigger rows that I was showing you can be substantial. Yes, ma'am.
What is the meaning of the 5 domes on Trinity?
Christ and the 4 apostles. They're symbolic. And there are various numbers on various churches that are symbolic of various things, but the 5 domes is the most common one, and that's the symbolism of that number. Yes, sir.
How did the the communists who had their headquarters right in the Kremlin
That's correct.
allow all those churches to stand when they were trying to destroy religion in Russia and were tearing down churches all over the place?
That's an extremely interesting question. Particularly during the Stalinist period, there was a so-called remodeling of Moscow, where many of the old medieval streets were straightened and widened, and oh gosh, that church was in the way, too bad. So a great number of churches were destroyed during that period. And one of the things that is very noticeable in the post-Soviet period is almost this urge to turn back the clock, to rebuild some of the churches that were destroyed in the 30s. There were some churches, though, like the ones that I've shown you, that were considered so much a part of the national heritage that even during the Stalinist time, they were preserved as architectural monuments. They were not functioning churches. Let's see, of the ones I've shown you this morning, I believe only Uspensky has been used for religious purposes. So the ones I've shown you today are still museums, but they were preserved, and they were preserved as the cultural heritage of the people, as architectural monuments. Yes, sir.
You were in Moscow during the Soviet era, and we asked a guy who was named Basil, by the way.
Yeah.
We said, how many Protestant churches are there in Moscow? He said, there are 2. He said, that's enough.
Well, it's interesting, prior to the 30s, it was known as having 40 times 40 churches, which is obviously a symbolic statement rather than a literal one, but it was the city of churches.
People actually go to church now, do they?
People actually go to church a great deal,
Uh-huh.
so yes.
Or did you do it before 1990 or?
Not as much before 1990. Yes, ma'am.
Well, I heard at one of the Orthodox festivals when I had a chance to go to, and Christianity is coming back because Gorbachev's mother was worried about it. That's what I was.
Yeah. I don't think that would be the reason.
Or son coming.
Yeah, but no, there certainly is a lot of church-related activity in Russia today. A lot of rebuilding of churches, a lot of people attending church, a lot of people having their children baptized, a lot of overt symbols of Christianity. It's an interesting development, and it's a complicated one. I don't think there's one single reason, but it certainly is noticeable. Yes, sir.
It was said that while Stalin was alive, he was going after the young people and the 20 and 30-year-olds. To answer her question, but he forgot about the grandmothers. And the grandmothers were the ones who were steeped in the religion. And they were the ones who, underground, kept the religion alive.
Thank you very much.